when I started to make some research about Asia and Africa. The fact is that, as you can notice, I guess, in contemporary art and music, here in Europe and in North America, or Oceania, Australia, New Zealand, people are mostly focused on what's going on here. And when we speak about Asia or Africa or Latin America, mostly people think about in terms of traditional art, traditional music, and so on. And I don't imagine that also in those places people do play modern music or classical, Western classical music, punk music, rock music, techno or experimental music, and so on. And I started step by step, very slowly in the 1990s and late 80s, but mostly in the 1990s, to tell myself that I would not believe that I could only find so-called experimental music from Europe, mostly Western Europe and Northern America. And I was sure that there were people in other places doing this kind of music as well. And slowly I discovered people in South Africa or in Japan. Back then it was more complicated than now, because I was just taking part of the mill art network and tape trading. So we were exchanging tapes through the post. There was no internet. It was pretty slow, but thanks to the advancement of technology and the internet, now it's it's way more easy to find whatever you are looking for. And in the let's say the first half of the 2000s, in 2004, I went 6 months to Far East Asia to meet musicians, composers, and see venues and to perform as well, and collect music. It was out of frustration, because many friends told me that I would never find anything. I was in China and in Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and so on, and I brought back more than 70 CDs and cassettes to show my friends that they were completely wrong. And I published a CD in 2007, including about 20 artists from 22 countries from Africa and Asia. So I traveled also a little bit in North Africa and the Middle East and South Asia in the past 11 years, in fact. And I started to write and search more also in the academical field to see what happened back then, because I studied electro-acoustic music in Belgium, so so-called experimental music, electronic music, acousmatic music in a conservatory. And what we saw was that according to their history, everything started in 1948 with Pierre Schaeffer in France, which is completely wrong to me, because there were composers before that, like Luigi Russolo and Antonio, a little bit here in Italy in the 1910. Walter Ruttmann in Germany, for example, also, or Johanna Bayer in the 1930s, and Russian composers also in the 1930s, 40s, and so on and so forth. And I discovered some of the composers from the 1950s, mostly in Asia. And that pushed me to write about it and to give lectures and so on. So before I speak a bit further about the history I discovered, I'm going to play a piece by Halim El-Dabh, who is a composer from Egypt, from Cairo, but who lives in the USA for a few decades now. And this is a piece he made in 1944. This is an extract of the piece. He lost apparently the full track, and it was made with a wire recorder, so it was before the tape recorder. It's the same principle, basically. You have a magnetic wire made of iron, and you record on it, and when it's full you can erase it. And with some of the models you could open it and cut the wire and solder it, basically, to make a collage or something. So it's a 2-minute piece. There are more seats for the people who want to not stand. So to me, this piece is a kind of UFO. It's really exceptional. It's the only piece from that time that I managed to find. It was composed, I find it interesting because it was composed in Cairo in the 1940s, and Halim, as far as I know, never heard anything else in, let's say, experimental music. Back then he was on his own and decided to experiment with this wire recorder and some recordings of, I think, women singing, as far as I remember. And he was completely disconnected to what happened in Europe, for example, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, regarding this kind of music. He later on went to study in the USA at the Princeton University, where many other composers collaborated or studied back then. Composers from Ghana, from Turkey, and so on and so forth. Regarding Africa and Asia, except this piece, whatever I found is from the 50s and later. But there is another, let's say, exception to me. It's Japan, where some composers, like maybe some, Tōru Takemitsu, who was a classical music composer, also did some experiments with sounds and electronic music. And already in 1948, he conceived a music that could use technology to create new sounds and new shapes. But the first electronic compositions in Japan, as far as I know, were made in the very early 1950s, partly thanks to the NHK, which is Sony basically, but it was called NHK earlier. They also had their own tape player, and they wanted to promote the tool, the instrument in a way, and asked a few composers from Japan to compose music to promote the tape player, and I'm going to play a small extract of what some composer did of it. This is an electronic music piece I'm going to play, a short extract because it's a very long one, but there were a lot of experiments with voices as well. This one was made by Makoto Moroi and Toshiro Mayuzumi in 1956, as far as I remember. So yes, it was in '56. Japan has been really a pioneer in electronic music and tape music and experimental music in Asia from the 50s, and then later from the 1970s. Many other scenes appeared in Japan, more, let's say, popular scenes not connected to academical scenes. And it's one of the few places in Asia where it started so early and so quickly and so fast, and where so many composers did electronic music. Another, again, neighbor country, South Korea, was a little bit active also in the 1960s and even in the late 1950s, thanks to Namjoon Paik, who was anyway not living there anymore. But South Korea did not wake up so fast, and only the contemporary scene from the 2000s is more active and mostly concentrated in Seoul, and a few other cities like Busan in the south, but it's very, very few people. On the other hand, Japan has been very active from Osaka and Tokyo, but spread absolutely everywhere almost. And it's only much later than some of the neighborhood countries started to wake up, let's say, like Indonesia or a little bit the Philippines, and above all China. But all this came much later than that. So I was mentioning Namjoon Paik. I'm going to play a 35-second track he made dedicated to John Cage in 1959. In fact, Namjoon Paik lived mostly in Japan and Germany and the USA. And while he was in Germany, he met a few composers like Cage, who inspired him, and he started to compose some music concrete and so on. He's mostly known for his video work, of course. So, while I'm in the 1950s, I will switch to the Philippines. There's also a kind of UFO in the 1950s in the Philippines. It's David Medalla, who's maybe you know, he's the kind of famous contemporary artist. Sorry, he's not really well known for his music. I managed to find a few publications on the internet. He published a few tracks on some vinyls in the 1980s, maybe 70s, but already in 1959 he composed two pieces in Manila that I unfortunately never managed to find. Between what he composed in the late 50s and as far as I know the 1970s, I never managed to find anything in the Philippines. Perhaps due to the dictatorship, again the Marcos dictatorship. But from the 1970s, another composer, Jose Mesada, started to compose a kind of music concrete like Pierre Schaeffer did, so using acoustic sounds and sort of treating them, but he was doing it in a different way, while the French school would use a tape player or vinyls, records, and do some collage with the sound that they pre-recorded. He would do some live performances. And I'm going to play a small extract of a long piece he made in the 1970s. So the principle is a bit similar to the one of Schaeffer. It's some sort of music concrete. But he would ask people to record something. One group of people would record some beating sticks, another one some voices, for example, or other instruments and so on. And he made a performance with several tapes, 7 as far as I remember, that were played all together through different radio stations in Manila. It was, I think, around 72, 74. And he asked people to go out in the streets with portable radios and to play the pieces all together. And it was this chaos in the city. So this has been recorded on CD, and I'm going to play a small extract. Jose Mesada. I will go back in time to Iran now. Iran stays a mystery for many people regarding art and music, but you have to know that in the late 60s and in the 1970s, Iran was pretty active regarding modern art, thanks to the Shah and his wife mostly, who were promoting, let's say, Western values and art and so on. And from 1967 until 1977, there was a festival, the Shiraz Festival, where musicians from a bit everywhere were invited to perform, but also performers, there was theatre, dance, poetry and so on. They invited a lot of traditional musicians, but also contemporary musicians like John Cage, Yannis Xenakis, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, and so on, went to perform there. And from the mid-60s, there were also a few composers from Iran who started to experiment with tapes and electronics. One of them is Alireza Mashayekhi, who is still composing in Iran nowadays. I'm going to play a small extract and then I tell you more. So it's a piece that he made in 1965. No, sorry. Not that one. He was mostly a classical music composer, and he still is anyway. He opened a school in Tehran many years ago for contemporary classical music, but started to record or perform electronic music again. But back in the 60s, 70s, Alireza Mashayekhi and another composer called Darius Dolat Shahi, who started to compose in 65, did collaborate in a way to the Shiraz festival. One piece of Mashayekhi was performed at the festival, and another one composed by Farihdullah Shahi was also presented at the festival. The plan was to open a school for electro-acoustic music in Iran, in Tehran, in the late 1970s, but unfortunately due to the Islamic Revolution, everything was cancelled, and the last festival happened in 1977. Then, because of the revolution and the new dictatorship and laws and so on, as far as we know, nothing happened between the late 1970s and somewhere in the 1990s, I don't know when exactly. But nowadays in Iran, it's starting again. It's been a decade around that some Iranians are composing electronic music again. And for about 2 years now, it's a bit more relaxed. And last year and this year, there were a few concerts and festivals. There is another festival again in December, dedicated to noise music, electroacoustic music, and so on. And there is a school in Tehran where you can study electroacoustic music for about 2 years now. I suspect that it is easier than some of the music styles in Iran, because mostly it is music with no lyrics. Because in Iran, if you want to perform or publish some music, if you have any lyrics, you need to submit the text. And then comes the censorship. So if you speak about politics, for example, you have almost no chance to publish anything. But this music is mostly instrumental, and these days it's okay. And Iran has one of the biggest scene, if I can call it a scene, in the Middle East, with a few other countries like Turkey, of course, Lebanon, even though everything is concentrated in Beirut mostly, and Israel, which is a case also pretty different than the other ones. While I speak about Israel, I can make myself a bit clear. As you know, Israel was created pretty late in history and was mostly made of immigrants coming from all over Europe and a little bit the Americas. So they brought Western technology and knowledge and culture in a Middle Eastern territory. So from the 1950s, late 50s, you can already find electronic music or experimental music in Israel, and the 60s and onwards, and nowadays, of course, mostly in the major cities. But at the very beginning, it was a kind of import. It was not, according to what I feel, something created straight there, even though many of the composers from Japan, from Iran, Turkey, or later on from China went to study in Germany, in France, in the USA, and so on, and went back to their countries and opened studios and started to compose music. They still had their own, let's say, local culture. And I think in Israel the context was very different, because the culture of many of those composers was the Western culture above all. Nowadays, I think that the scene became different in that country, in Israel, and it has a real identity, I would say, and not a copy of what happened in the 50s, 60s in Germany, for example, and so on and so forth. But due to the political situation and the war and everything, Israel is pretty disconnected from the countries around. There are very little connections with Turkey, for example, that doesn't boycott Israel, for example. Mostly Israel is connected with the West or with Japan and so on, more than with people from Lebanon or Egypt and so on. Especially with people from Lebanon, for example, because it's simply forbidden by law in Lebanon. You cannot communicate with people from Israel, you cannot go to Israel, and so on and so forth. So the boycott, censorship, whatever you name it, makes it a bit difficult to have an exchange, even though it happened sometimes. There is also a small scene in Palestine, which is of course way younger, pretty active. Some don't live in Palestine anymore, some still survive there. But the communication between Palestine and Israel is also pretty small. I know some Palestinians who played in Israel in the past, but they tend to avoid it because there is a kind of general boycott now. It's not that they are at war with the people who would like to invite them from Israel, it's just that they boycott the state of Israel. So mostly the people from Palestine, or they play in Palestine in Ramallah, or they play abroad, in Europe especially. So while I'm in the Middle East, I have to talk about Turkey, which is in between something. So a small part of Turkey is in Europe, as you know. Part of Istanbul is there, and the rest is in Asia. But from the late 50s, with Bülent Arel in '59, Turkey saw also some composers doing electronic music and experimental music, electro-acoustic and so on. But they never stayed over there. There was Bülent Arel and later on Minao Shibata, just a little bit later in the 1960s. But the political situation made it really difficult for them to be able to build a studio over there due to the different regimes and coup d'etats and so on. So they moved to the USA. And I'm going to play an extract of a piece by Minao Shibata that he composed in 1972 with Freddie Hubbard, who was an American jazz man. It's a piece I always select because Minao Shibata was somebody really political. He often spoke about the war. He was anti-war and anti-racism and so on. And this is something that you don't so often see in this academical, electroacoustic, experimental music scene. Somebody who openly speaks about this kind of topic like war. It's often abstract music, instrumental music and so on, but it was not systematically like this. And he was also somebody with not only an electronic music background, and you feel it in his music, where he would mix state music, electronic music, classical music and jazz all together on a piece. So I'm playing a small part of one piece.
the old pagan notion that to be a man is to belong to a race endowed with reason, to belong to it as a specimen, so that the race or species is higher than the individual, which is to say that there are no more individuals, but only specimens. The crowd is the untruth.
Collected words of homo homini lupus, masses, multitudes, mob, nation, nationalism.
A crowd in its very concept is the untruth by reason of the fact that it renders the individual irresponsible, complete,
Circle, grade. Communion, creed,
where there is a multitude,
religion,
a crowd,
bias,
there it is sure
bigotry, Muslim, Christian, Catholic,
private, the
Protestant,
highest.
Jew, Gentile, politician.
Only one
Comparison,
attains the
black, white,
which is not made in
Caucasian,
a comparative
Polynesian, Oriental,
comparison takes
Occidental, Teutonic,
every
to
man
exploit,
be cherished.
use, sell,
To be an
to buy,
is akin
competitor,
to deity,
bigot.
where there is a multitude.
So basically, in Turkey, it's only from the 1980s that some people started to compose in Istanbul and Ankara mostly, and I guess later Izmir, electronic music, experimental noise, and so on. That was a bit difficult, of course, due to the military regime, the censorship. It's also a pretty conservative country at a certain level, not everywhere, not in Istanbul, for example. The way it sort of came back to Turkey is pretty interesting, because you have these academical people like Minao Shibata, for example, or Ara, who moved away, and for some of them never came back to their country. And then in the late 1970s and 1980s, some young men went to work in Berlin and London. In the 1970s, it was the explosion of punk music and industrial music also in London or in Berlin and other places, and they were exposed to this kind of music, and they would send back home some magazines and cassettes, vinyls, or come back home and copy them. And there were some stores in Istanbul, for example, where people would sell those cassettes containing punk music or industrial music like Herbert Voltaire and so on. And this is how many people discovered this music in Turkey back then. And one of them is 25BZ. I don't know if you ever heard about this man. He's often playing in Europe. So he started to play in 1986 already some industrial and noise music, collage, and so on. And from that point, it developed step by step. It was a bit slow, maybe in the 1980s. But back in time again a little bit with Indonesia. So Indonesia was a Dutch colony, and it was a bit easier back then for students to go and study in the Netherlands. And one of them, Slamet Abdul Shukur, who studied classical composition and Indonesian traditional music like gamelan, went to study also in the Netherlands. And he is, as far as we know, the first composer in Indonesia to have composed tape music and electronic music from 1963. Unfortunately, he passed away last year, and I'm not sure he ever published, at least certainly not in the West, anything. Maybe in Indonesia some tapes. I managed to get some recordings. I hope to get more. But I'm going to play a piece he made, but I think it's from the 1970s or 80s, but I'm not sure. So also a very, very long piece, so I'm just playing a short extract. So Indonesia is to me a very special country. Again, due to a certain dictatorship, the Suharto dictatorship, before the 1990s, you could hardly find anything, at least from the popular scene, let's say industrial music, noise and so on. But you can find some modern classical and electro-acoustic tape music composers from this academical background. From the 60s and 70s, 80s, there was Tōru Shibata and many other people. But from the mid-1990s, from 95 around, some individuals started to compose also whole with tapes, with electronic gears and so on. And it was also a kind of protest regarding the regime, because they were facing problems. They faced them many times and during a long time. But they never stopped, and Indonesia has got one of the biggest underground scene regarding music for the whole Southeast and even Far East Asia. I would say that Japan has a huge scene for sure and very old, but if you exclude Japan, Indonesia is to me one of the biggest with China also, where in some of the major islands you can find, even in some small villages, people doing sound experiments and noise and electronic music. They have festivals. It's a very, very active scene. At any level, in the case of Indonesia, it's even not regarding sound art and electronic music. It's punk music, it's electronic, it's rock music, it's metal, it's absolutely everything. It's also video art and painting and graffiti. It's a pretty amazing place. Where there are concerts all the time. It's really alive, and there is no strict censorship anymore against this kind of music in Indonesia, which is at a certain point a more liberal country than Malaysia, which is in a way more modern, but that applies a lot of censorship. They voted a Sharia law, for example, against metal music a few years ago. You don't face that in Indonesia, except in Aceh, which is a province pretty apart of the rest. So you are free to do this music, and the young people are extremely active in this country. So I see that it's already late, so I need to go quickly to Africa. In Africa the context can be very different. There is, I would say, I see roughly 3 parts in Africa. There is South Africa, which is which was, especially in the past, even though it's still now, an exception in the whole Africa, because it was a Western colony, a very strong racist regime, where a white minority had all power and was connected to Europe, the Netherlands, UK, Germany, and it's no surprise that very early in South Africa you can find some experimental music. So the first composer who did experimental music in South Africa was Henk Badding, but he was not South African. He was a Dutch composer who was teaching in Germany, but who escaped Germany when the German authorities discovered that he had collaborated with the Nazis, and of course he went to South Africa, no surprise. But weirdly, he composed for the national radio an experimental music piece in the 1950s that I will not play for you because I don't have it. I never managed to find it, unfortunately. But in the 50s and 60s, I did not find anything else than him. And then from the 1970s, it started at an academical level. In some universities, some composers did electro-acoustic music. As I said, South Africa was the minority active in modern art in South Africa was really a Western population. Nowadays, fortunately, it has changed, and you find people of all backgrounds there involved in this music. And South Africa is one of the few countries in Africa, with mostly Egypt, Tunisia, that's it, where you can find festivals for experimental music, electronic music, and so on. So the second part I see in Africa is North Africa. That is to say, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria at a lower level, and Morocco, where you find people, especially in Egypt and Tunisia, organizing events almost every week, lots of musicians, and a lot of exchanges between Europe and the Middle East. Because there is this Arab connection, of course. They speak more a kind of similar language. They share a sort of similar culture, or not too different culture. So there are some exchanges between countries like Egypt and Tunisia and Lebanon or Jordan, for example, and Europe, because of the colonization through France mostly, and the UK, and families living also here around. But all these came very, very late, as far as I know, in North Africa. I did not find any composers from the 50s, 60s, and so on there, except Halim El-Dabh in Egypt, even though I suspect there might have been some. In the 70s, there were very few connected to popular music in Algeria and Morocco. But if we speak about a scene, it's mostly since the years 2000 that there are young people in the major cities, so Alexandria, Cairo mostly, Tunis, Algiers, and Marrakesh, Rabat, Casablanca, where people are active and doing electronic music. But there is this strong European connection. Europe is very close, and some of these composers and musicians can more or less easily or less easily come here. And the third part I see in Africa is sub-Saharan Africa, except South Africa, where I find some pockets here and there with one or more people, but not a real scene, doing some experiment in sound. But it's still hard for me to find that, because I haven't been to sub-Saharan Africa since I left it when I was a baby. The political and economical context doesn't help, of course, because let's face it, many of those people doing this kind of music, especially in Africa, but a little bit in some parts of Asia, are middle-class people or very rich people. Except in very few places like Indonesia, for some reasons I still don't explain, you rarely see people coming from poor families doing that, simply because it can be a lack of education, but still, even if you lack of education, you can still want to experiment, but there is a lack of money also, and a lack of time. When your first problems are to feed your family, or to find a job, or to escape conflict, you don't lose time to try to experiment with sounds in general. There might be exceptions, yeah, I know some, but anyway. I'm going now to play a small extract of a modern piece made by Victor Gama, who is a composer from Angola. So it's very contemporary, it's from the 2000s. Who is also a composer I like because he's pretty eclectic. He plays modern classical music like the minimalists, like Philip Glass, Steve Reich, and so on. He plays more electronic music and experimental music, where he mixes electronic processes and so-called tradition. He makes his own instruments based on traditional Angolese instruments and creates some music with them. And he can be also political, like you will hear in this piece, where some people speak about the civil war in Angola.
Nana, andi katuma message molo wanda ngobe yange. Talia. Tukatuma message molo wanda batalia nana. Jesi mui kovela kwitu kwana wala. Jesi dada ba kwitu kwana wala batalia. A message halo wanda tata yange. Tukatuma message molo wanda batalia. A message halo wanda tata yange. Tukatuma message halo wanda batalia. Amisaji molo wanda da ke jese go I kovera kwitu kwana vale jese jinda da ma kwitu kwana vale batalia tukatuma misaji halo wanda da ke batalia tukatuma misaji halo wanda da munana batalia tata neje angede munana jese go hinda da ma kwitu kwana vale Jese koko shaku itu kwana wale dalia jikatuma message halo wanda de munana a message molo wanda batalia jirekere ni demo eje batalia nana tabakane ni demo lelo batalia banana demo ba mutoda batalia batalia na demo ba mutoda lelo batalia jese ko ikovela kwitu kwana wale Jese je kovela kwitu kwana vale tuma message halo wanda da a message wa kuleka de munade
theatre company. And we used to go up to Rundu and Oshakati. And once in Rundu, it was in 1979, and it was during the war, we saw a war happening across the river. So we could see the mortars and the fire, and we could hear a whole war happening. And the people from Rundu, people from the SADF and the people living in Rundu, built their trains on the side of the river, and they were watching the war. And I had no idea. You couldn't have an idea of what is happening. And the next morning, when we went for breakfast at a rest house, a hotel, we saw Portuguese people that walked that night from the village.
So I was speaking about those pockets I find. I managed to find some people in Mauritius or in Kenya, for example, or in the past in Zaire and the Congo, doing some electronic music ranging from really pure experimental stuff to electronica or more techno and so on. But it's still a long process for me regarding Africa, because the infrastructures also don't always allow me to easily communicate with people there. I've got a lot of contacts in Asia. I've been often there, and it's partly thanks to the internet. And in many places in Africa, the internet connections are not really good, or people are not on the internet. So it's less easy to gather informations from a big part of Africa. I would say not everywhere. I managed to find people also in Nigeria, for example. But it's most of the time some people, and I cannot speak about a scene. I could speak about a scene in Egypt or South Africa or Tunisia, but in most other African countries it's very, very few people doing this kind of music, as far as I know. You find a lot of hip hop, for example, because it's very political. A lot of people want to express themselves, and you see more and more people doing metal, death metal, a lot in Mozambique, in Botswana, in Angola, and the whole Arab world anyway, because it's also something really political. There is a country I did not speak about in Asia. I wanted to keep it for the end. It's China. Of course, there are many other countries I could speak about, like India, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, and so on. But it's also small pockets here and there in many of those places. Like in Pakistan, you find people in Lahore or Islamabad doing this kind of music. In India, in the south, you can find in Bangalore or in the north, New Delhi, some people, Kolkata. But they are often pretty disconnected, and I would never speak, at least now, about a real scene. It's a few individuals doing this kind of music, and I hardly found anything really old, except for the cinema industry in India, the Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, where you can find some films connected to science fiction and horror films and so on in the 70s, 80s that included electronic and experimental music soundtracks. But China. So in China before, let's say 1979, I don't think it's possible to find anything, because music was very restricted. You could play propaganda music, state music, that was it. No, perhaps traditional music, but no modern music, no rock, no pop, nothing. From 1979, the regime changed due to the change of president, basically, and it became a bit easier. And in 1984, some composers at the Conservatory of Beijing gave the first experimental music concert ever in China. Non-officially, no authorization, but they made it. And since then, step by step, more studios opened and more composers connected to the academical scene did some experimental music until the late 90s. And from the late 90s, a lot of people like you and me, not connected to any music school or art school, started to compose electronic music. Partly again thanks to the internet communication and so on, and also foreigners living there bringing music. And since then the scene exploded. You find people in every major cities in China. It's huge, and festivals and concerts, official or not. But because it's often small, the authorities just turn a blind eye and say nothing. And again, because often there are no lyrics, so that's it, tolerated. There is no real pressure against this music anymore in China. Something you still can find in Vietnam, for example. The scene is very small in Vietnam, especially concentrated in Hanoi and a bit in Ho Chi Minh. But you never know what can happen in Vietnam when you organize something. The police can always come and tell you no. And then you have to pack and go, and that's it. Even though it became easier than 10 years ago, it can be still a bit difficult. But in China, with few exceptions that happen sometimes, when there is a big event, for example, like there were the Olympics, in that case, they would control a lot of things. If there is no major event, you do whatever you want in China. It's pretty easy. And I'm going to play a piece by Jingjing Luo. She's a composer from China who moved to the USA, and she composed in, as far as I remember, 1986, this piece. It's the oldest Chinese piece I managed to find in this field of music.
Give up now. Put an end to your troubles. Is there a difference between yes and no? Is there a difference between good and evil? Must
extremely shortly because it's like it. So nowadays a bit everywhere in Asia, even in surprising places like Afghanistan, for example, you can find electronic music ranging from really popular music to more experimental stuff. And like I said previously, I think it's partly due to the internet, where even isolated people can discover this music through social networks and the easy way to communicate. And sometimes thanks to foreigners going to those places and bringing music, organizing events, concerts, and so on. I think the same development also in Africa, and maybe not in such a large scale than almost everywhere in Asia, I would say. But it's still going faster and faster and faster, and you find more and more composers from Africa, from Asia, coming to Europe to perform, and there is a bigger and bigger interest in Europe regarding this music from Africa and Asia.